Recently had a conversation with a friend who wanted to migrate away from his legacy BPM application, which I think is terrific. I'm really excited about that. But then he wanted to migrate to AWS Step Functions. And I'm a little bit less enthusiastic about that. I thought about why I felt that way, and I decided to articulate my reasons. So these are the 10 reasons that I think that perhaps transitioning from a BPM process to AWS Step Functions all by themselves is not necessarily the way to go. Reason number one, there isn't really a good visual editor for AWS Step Functions. Yes, it definitely has a visual editor. But if you start doing anything that's non-trivial with that visual editor, you're going to find that it quickly becomes overwhelming. Moreover, it doesn't really have an articulation for the inputs and the outputs of the various components. So what that means is that it kind of becomes this programmatic paradigm where everything is global and you're sharing state. It's messy. If you're a software engineer and you don't use encapsulation, it's going to make you itch. And that sort of makes me itch. Reason number two. Can you control the sequence of steps? Can you go from one step to another side based on what happened in the previous step? Yes, you absolutely can. However, it's a really sequential flow. And what that means is that it becomes very difficult to do things like kick off asynchronous timers or have interruptive message events or that sort of thing. You will find that your initial ability to get the job done is not bad, but it will not be able to flex. You will incur technical debt because you won't be able to do the nuanced things like parallel processing and concurrent execution with state modification and compensation events and all the other goodies that I'll actually get to in just a little bit. You can't really do timeouts in a way that is realistic. So you can definitely do timeouts in AWS Step Functions. However, if you need to do non-interrupting timeouts or escalations based on timers, that is where you kind of have to end up building your own mechanisms for doing that, and that's never a good thing. It's not just the fact that the framework doesn't support that. It's the fact that the framework didn't think to support that. It tells you that it's a limited use case. It's great if you don't expect your processes to change. But if your processes are going to get used, they're going to want to change. Your users and your customers are going to come back and say, can we do an exception for this? Can we do an escalation for that? This is a use case that deserves some attention. And you're going to find that you've painted yourself into a corner. Exception handling. Now, AWS Step Functions do allow you to do retry logic for exceptions. However, when you get into the real world, you're going to find that you're going to want boundary events and exceptions that are happening during the execution of a process. You're going to find that you're going to have entry events and you're going to have asynchronous events that are happening. There's really not support for anything other than straight through exception handling in AWS Step Functions. So for example, if you have an interrupted cancel event that happens, say someone is processing an order and while you're processing the order, they decide to cancel. That kind of stuff is really hard to do. It can be done, but it's not what the language is designed for. It doesn't really have that vocabulary. You have to glue things together. And that kind of stuff happens all the time in business. Can you do compensation events in AWS Step Functions? Not really. So compensation events are an unrolling of a transaction. So for example, let's say you have a situation where someone has paid for an order and you're shipping it and you have to do a compensation because they've decided to cancel. A compensation event would be an unwinding. So first you maybe reach out and you tell the warehouse not to ship the order. And then from there, you confirm that the money hits your bank account so you can unwind that and give them back the money, and so on and so forth. A compensation event is an articulate, nuanced unrolling of the steps that you took. It's really important when you're doing realistic business processes. And there's just no vocabulary for describing that in the AWS world. You can roll your own, you can create your own grammar, you can create your own sequence, and a lot of really wonderful, talented AWS Step programmers that I know, do have these sort of programmer's bag of tricks, but they're not standardized and they rely on individual talent. Individual talent is fantastic if you're the one who's talented. It's not as great if you've got to manage a program and that program is consistently reliant on heroic effort. AWS Step Functions do not support native versioning. So in BPM engines, you can have one version of a process concurrently running with an updated version. So what that means is that there are separate threads of co-executing code that are actually happening in parallel. For example, let's say you have a loan process and you want people that started in January to be able to finish with that, but you made changes in February, and the people that are starting in February get the new version. In BPM systems, and I think this is true for all BPM systems, that can actually be natively supported. That is not the case in AWS. You can't really do that. You've got one running thread. The idea of being able to wean off doesn't really exist. You can build it, but by the time you're done, you've kind of built a homegrown BPM system. AWS Step Functions do have some limited reporting capabilities. So you can set up things like CloudWatch and listen for the start and the end of a process. But with BPM system, you get super articulate, well-designed reporting. Things like, well, the cost of a good in November tends to go up because people are shopping for Christmas, and this is a red item that's popular in China. That sort of insight is part and parcel of how BPM systems work. And it's just not really there when you talk about AWS Step Functions. AWS Step Functions do absolutely serve a purpose, but it is not that. It is not process improvement. And the reality is that when you build a process, if people are using it, they're going to want to improve it. They're going to come with suggestions because times change, inflation changes, political, social, the needs and the expectations of customers change. You're going to want to be anti-fragile. And you can't really do that with AWS Step Functions. They're not designed for that. They're designed to do something once that's fairly static and isn't going to be changing a lot over time. If you're building systems like that, you're kind of in a minority in the enterprise software world, because as my experience reads it, things change very quickly. AWS Step Functions don't really have a built-in rule engine. A rule engine is a really fantastic part of almost every BPM engine, because what it allows you to do is it allows you to separate out the business logic from the execution logic. So for example, you could have a rule that decides when we're going to, say, give people a loan based on their income, and then you can change just that rule. So you could say, for example, that, interest rates have gone up, so we're going to be changing the amount that we charge for a loan or the number of points we give or that sort of thing. And you can change just that piece of it without having to change the entire system. There is no native capacity to do that with AWS Step Functions. Now, you can absolutely, write an if statement and put it into your AWS Step Function sequence and execute it from there. But even that has to be deployed in sort of a monolithic way, and everything has to be retested again all together. It's just inherently clumsy. Whereas if you're using a BPM system that is designed for that sort of nuanced surgical change. And that's what really helps you out. Are there event triggers in AWS Step Functions? Absolutely. So you can do things like a task and a wait state, and you can do things like with an event bridge or an SNS in order to be able to mimic the functionality of changing meta state along the execution of your process. But even with that, you've got to roll a lot of your own logic. You've got to have sort of a tribal knowledge understanding of how these things kind of work. You're probably going to have to put something on copy queues and pull them back out and have some articulation of this means that when it's structured that way. Whereas when you're using a BPM system for this purpose, it's all articulated, it's standard-based, there's a consistent way to do it, and there's so much nuance. I think there are, 23 different kinds of events that are handled out of the box. The ability to reach for the right tool at the right time is the key to good craftsmanship. And what I'm recommending is that you consider starting with the right tools. And finally, compensation events. Compensation events are something that I really, really like in BPM systems. They are a systematic unrolling of a process. It's not just rolling back a transaction. It's all the nuance and articulation of rolling back exactly the right step of the transaction depending on where you were interrupted. It's a sort of a critical undo function that can make things so incredibly difficult if you don't have it in place. There's just no vocabulary for that in AWS Step Functions, and it's all over the place in all BPM systems. And the reason for that is because we in the BPM world are used to solving business problems from business people who have to deal with changing customer demands and changing contexts on weekly, monthly, sometimes daily basis. We have systems for this sort of thing, and AWS Step Functions just do not. Now, I've been kind of hard on AWS Step Functions. I don't mean to imply that they are not useful. I actually think they're fantastic and I use them all the time. But the way that I use them is that I allow them to do atomic actions very, very well, very, very efficiently. But I orchestrate the sequence and the calling of those, the inputs and the outputs to those, using a BPM system. And because of that, I get the flexibility of BPM and the convenience and the low cost of AWS Step Functions. Something to think about. All right. Thank you.